The ghosts of my past do not rattle chains or moan in the attic. They arrive via the United States Postal Service. My life, for the past 40 years, has been a meticulously constructed fortress against the intrusions of my own history. My home. A 3-story Italianate house in the heart of Savannah's historic district is the physical manifestation of this defense. My husband, David, a retired architectural historian, and I spent a decade restoring it, not as a monument to be admired, but as a sanctuary to be lived in. The walls are lined with books from floor to ceiling, their spines a colorful, chaotic tapestry that tells the story of our shared life of the mind. The air smells of old paper, lemon oil polish, and the sweet, heavy scent of the jasmine that climbs the wrought iron of our courtyard garden. It is a house built on a foundation of quiet, of order, and of a peace so profound it is almost a sacred vow. My work, too, is a form of sanctuary. As a writer of historical fiction, I spend my days in conversation with the dead. I find it, on the whole, far more civilized than conversing with the living. The dead do not make unreasonable demands. They do not guilt-trip you. They simply offer up the beautiful, complex, and often tragic stories of their lives. And my job is to listen, to interpret, and to give them a voice. My current project was a sprawling, multi-generational novel about a family of silk merchants in 18th century Lyon, a world of intricate craftsmanship and secret passions. I was, on this particular Tuesday morning in late September, completely and blissfully lost in it. I was in my library, a magnificent 2-story room that was the heart of our home, wrestling with a chapter about the devastating social and economic impact of a silkworm blight. The only sounds were the soft scratching of my fountain pen on a fresh sheet of paper, the gentle whir of the ceiling fan overhead, and the distant, melodic chime of the cathedral bells marking the 11 o'clock hour. David was in his study, across the hall, working on a monograph about Savannah's unique ironwork. Later, we would have a simple lunch in the courtyard. Later still, we would take our customary long walk through the city's moss-draped squares. It was a life of beautiful, predictable, and hard-won routine. A life where the only dramas were the ones I carefully constructed on the page. It is a dangerous thing to become too comfortable in one's peace. It makes you forget that the world outside your fortress is messy and unpredictable. It makes you forget that some ghosts do not need an invitation to cross your threshold. The mail arrived, as it always did, at 11:30. David, on his way to the kitchen to make us tea, retrieved it from the slot in our front door. He walked into the library, sorting through the small pile. An invitation to the Historical Society's winter gala, he said, placing a thick, cream-colored envelope on my desk. A royalty statement from your publisher. Looks like the paperback edition is still selling well. He paused, a strange note in his voice. And this. He held out a single, thin, business-sized envelope. It was made of cheap, flimsy paper. The postmark was from a small, forgettable town in the most rural part of South Georgia, and the address was written in a shaky, spidery, and achingly familiar handwriting. My mother's eyes stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake that had just appeared on my desk. My heart, which had been beating at a calm, scholarly rhythm, gave a single, hard, painful thud against my ribs. It had been, I calculated with the swift, detached precision of a historian. 8 years since the last Christmas card, and nearly 15 since I had received an actual, personal letter. Contact with my parents, Robert and Mary Ann Vance, was A thing of the past, a ruin I had long since stopped trying to excavate. Nora, David said gently, his hand coming to rest on my shoulder. Are you all right? I'm fine, I said, my voice a lie. I took the letter from him. The paper felt thin and insubstantial in my hand, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. With a sense of profound dread, I slid it open. The note inside was short, written on a single sheet of floral-bordered stationery. The handwriting was even shakier than the address on the envelope. Eleanor, it began. The formal use of my full name was a clear sign of the chasm between us. I hope this letter finds you well. Your father and I are fine, though things have been difficult lately. We have a family matter of some importance that we need to discuss. With you in person. We have decided to drive up to Savannah next week. We should arrive on Tuesday afternoon. It was not a request. It was an announcement. A royal proclamation. There was no if it's a good time for you. No, we would. Love to see you. Just a simple, blunt statement of their impending arrival. We have booked a room at a motel. You don't need to worry about that. We will call you when we get into town. Sincerely, your mother, Mary Ann Vance. I read the letter twice. Then handed it to David. He read it, his expression hardening. A family matter? He said, his voice laced with a quiet, protective anger. After 15 years of near-total silence, they have a family matter. And they're not asking to visit. They are informing you of their arrival. The arrogance is breathtaking. He was right. It was breathtaking. It was also completely, utterly in character. My parents had never been ones for polite requests. Their worldview was simple and absolute. They were the parents. I was the child. And the child, no matter that she was now 58 years old, was expected to be available. What do you think it is? I asked, though a cold, ugly certainty was already beginning to form in my gut. My father, a man whose pride was a force of nature, would never admit to having difficult times unless the situation was catastrophic. Money, David said instantly. It has to be your father and his investments. He didn't need to finish the sentence. My father, a man who had spent his life as a hardware store manager, had always fancied himself a secret financial genius. He was a proud, stubborn man who had a deep-seated contempt for experts and a fatal attraction to high risk. Speculative ventures he read about in cheap magazines. For years, I had heard through the family grapevine and network. I had long since muted about his get-rich-quick schemes. Emu farming in the 90s. It's a series of disastrous house-flipping projects during the 2008 financial crisis. Most recently, I had heard he had poured their entire retirement savings into some new, incomprehensible world of cryptocurrency. So, after 40 years of telling me my life's work was a worthless hobby, I said, a bitter, ironic laugh escaping. My lips, they're coming to the hobbyist for a bailout. It would seem so, David said grimly. He took my hand. We don't have to see them, Nora. You don't owe them this. You can say no. I knew he was right. But the conditioning of a lifetime, the deeply ingrained role of the daughter, is a difficult thing to shrug off. No, I have to, I said, my voice a sigh of resignation. I have to see what this is. I have to hear it from them. The week leading up to their arrival was a week of quiet, creeping dread. Fie. The peace of our home was gone, replaced by a tense, waiting energy. I found I couldn't work. The story of my 18th century silk merchants felt frivolous, a silly distraction. in the face of the impending collision with my own, much more brutal history. My fortress had been breached, not by a frontal assault, but by a single, flimsy piece of floral stationery dot. My mind, unbidden, kept drifting back, not to the big, dramatic explosion of my departure, but to the small daily erosions that had led up to it. I remembered being 12 years old, my nose buried in a copy of Jane Eyre, and my father snatching it from my hands. "You should be reading something useful, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice a disappointed rumble. "Not filling your head with this romantic nonsense. There's no future in it." I remembered being 16 and proudly showing my mother a poem I had written that had won a small local prize. She had read it, her expression blank. "That's nice, dear," she'd said, before folding it up and placing it on the counter. "Now, have you finished your chores? The dishes aren't going to wash themselves." They had never been cruel, not in the active, malicious sense. They had simply been dismissive. My world, the world of books, of stories, of ideas, was an alien territory to them, and they treated it with a kind of fearful contempt. It was not practical. It was not sensible, and therefore it was worthless. Their love was a conditional thing, and the condition was that I become a smaller, more practical, more sensible version of myself. A version that fit into the small, neat box of their world. My crime was not that I had failed them. My crime was that I had refused to be small enough. By the time Tuesday afternoon arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. David and I sat in our living room, pretending to read, but we were both just listening. Listening for the sound that would signal the arrival of the past. At precisely 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Its cheerful, melodic chime sounded like a death knell. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. David squeezed my hand. "A whirr. In this together," he whispered. I opened the door. And there they were, my parents. They looked old. So much older than I remembered. My father, who had always seemed like a giant to me, was stooped, the proud set of his shoulders now a weary slump. My mother's face was a fine web of worry lines, her once bright eyes now faded and anxious. They were two elderly, defeated strangers standing on my doorstep. And for a moment, a wave of pure, uncomplicated pity washed over me. Then my father looked past me, his eyes taking in the grand book-lined hallway of my home. He looked at the art on the walls, at the antique rug on the floor. And I saw a flicker of the old resentment, the old dismissive judgment in his eyes. "Well," he said, his voice a gravelly, unimpressed grunt, "looks like the worthless hobby paid off after all." And just like that, the pity was gone, replaced by the familiar cold and quiet anger that I had carried like a stone in my heart for 40 years. The ghosts had not just arrived. They had brought their baggage. My father's opening salvo, his backhanded compliment about my worthless hobby, set the tone for the entire visit. It was a declaration that even though they had come to my territory, they had no intention of surrendering their own deeply entrenched worldview. They were here, in my home, but they were not here to see my life. They were here to judge it. "Well, let's get your bags," David said, his voice a smooth, calm barrier between my father's gruffness and my own rising anger. He was a master diplomat, my husband. A man who had spent a lifetime navigating the passive-aggressive minefields of academic faculty meetings. He was, I suspected, about to face his greatest challenge. I led them into the house. The awkwardness was a physical presence, a third guest that had arrived with them. The hug my mother gave me was stiff, her body rigid, as if embracing a stranger. She had been forced to acknowledge at a party. My father just stood by the door, holding their two worn, shabby suitcases, his eyes sweeping across my foyer with a look of profound suspicion. "It's very open," my mother said, her gaze taking in the 20-foot ceilings and the wide-arching doorways that led into the living room and my library. It was not a compliment. In her world, a world of small, practical rooms and low ceilings, open was a synonym for wasteful and cold. We tried to honor the original 1880s architecture. I said, my voice the polite, detached tone of a tour guide. The goal was to restore the sense of space and light, was my father's only reply, trying to be a good hostess. The dutiful daughter they had never really wanted, I offered them a tour. It was a mistake. The tour was not a pleasant sharing of my life. It was an indictment of it, with my parents as the silent, prosecuting attorneys. We started in the heart of my home, the library. It is, without exaggeration, a magnificent room. 2 stories high, with a rolling ladder and floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with thousands of books, history, poetry, art, fiction. A lifetime of learning and passion. It is the room where I work, where I dream, where I feel most myself. My father stood in the center of the room and looked up, a slow, grudging whistle escaping his lips. "Good Lord, Eleanor, how much did all this cost?" he asked. It was his first and only question. Not, "What do you read?" Not, "What are you writing?" But, "What did it cost?" "It's an investment, Robert," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "Seems like a poor one," he muttered, running a thick finger over the spine of a leather-bound volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. "Of the Roman Empire. Could have put 2 nice bedrooms and a full bath in this space. Would have increased your resale value." He saw a library and calculated its worth in hypothetical bedrooms. That was the fundamental, unbridgeable chasm between us. I saw a sanctuary. He saw a failure of practical imagination. My mother was no better. She drifted through the living room, her eyes flicking over the art I had spent years collecting. A beautiful, challenging, abstract oil painting by a young Savannah artist. A series of stark black and white photographs from the civil rights era. A single perfect piece of mid-century modern sculpture. "It's all very colorful, dear," she said, peering at the abstract painting as if it might bite her. "Is it supposed to be something?" "It's supposed to make you feel something," David answered for me, his voice smooth as silk. "The artist is exploring the tension between order and chaos." "I see," my mother said, though her expression made it clear she did not see at all. "Well, it certainly is. Energetic." On and on it went. My kitchen, with its professional-grade wolf range, was far too much stove for just 2 people. My peaceful, minimalist bedroom was impersonal. My beautiful, lush courtyard garden, a place where I spent hours every week, was filled with all sorts of things that probably attract bugs. Every compliment was a veiled criticism, every observation a judgment. They were touring the life of a successful, independent woman, and all they could see were the choices of a daughter who had failed to live up to their small, sensible expectations. The tour ended mercifully, and we all retreated to the living room, the space between us, now charged with a decade of unspoken resentments. David, ever the diplomat, tried to build a bridge. He asked them about their drive, about their neighbors, about the church bake sale. My parents answered in monosyllables, their attention focused on me. They were sizing me up, assessing the value of the asset before making their pitch. This is a very big house for just two people, isn't it? My mother asked, her eyes sweeping the room again. We like the space, I said. The subtext of her question was as subtle as a sledgehammer. You have so much. We have so little. Must. Be nice, my father grunted, not having to worry about money. The comment was so profoundly, willfully ignorant of the 40 years of relentless, grinding work that had gone into my success that I almost laughed. The memory it triggered was sharp and bitter. I was 25, a graduate assistant living in a tiny, roach-infested apartment in Chapel Hill. I had a dental abscess that was causing me blinding pain. A root canal, the dentist told me, would be $2,000. $2,000 I absolutely did not have. I was too proud and too certain of the answer to ask my parents for help. So I sold my car, a beat-up but reliable Toyota, to pay for it. I took the bus for the next 2 years. The memory of that desperate, humiliating time. Of my father's voice on the phone telling me that my graduate degree was a waste of time and that if I was broke, I should just get a real job was a stark contrast to his current passive-aggressive envy. He had not been there for me in my poverty, and now he was here to lay claim to my success. The dance of evasion continued for what felt like an eternity. They spoke of the rising price of gas, of the new pastor at their church, of a cousin's gallbladder surgery. They were circling the real topic, their desperation a palpable thing in the room, but their pride a wall they could not seem to scale. It was David, finally, who decided to force the issue. So, Marianne, Robert, he said, his voice gentle but firm. You said in your letter that you had a family matter to discuss. We're here. We're listening. The directness of the question seemed to startle them. My mother looked at my father, her eyes wide, silently passing the baton. This was his territory. He was the man of the house. He was the one who handled the ugly business of money. My father cleared his throat. His folksy, small-town charm completely gone, replaced by the grim, resentful expression of a man forced to admit defeat. He began to tell his story. It was a long, rambling, and deeply self-pitying monologue. He spoke of his investments not as the foolish hire scambles they were, but as a series of brilliant moves that had been sabotaged by a crooked government and a volatile market. He painted himself as the victim of a system designed to crush the little guy. He spoke of the cryptocurrency crash, of the reverse mortgage, of the second and third loans he had taken out against the house. He never once used the word mistake. He never once said, I was wrong. I listened to his litany of blame, my expression a careful, neutral mask. He was the same man he had always been, proud, stubborn, and completely incapable of taking responsibility for his own failures. The monologue finally, mercifully, reached its conclusion. He had lost everything. The house had been repossessed by the bank. Their savings were gone. Their Social Security was not enough to cover the rent on even a small apartment in their hometown. They were at 78 and 76 years. Old, destitute. So that's it, he finished, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He looked at me, his eyes now hard, not with the look of a man asking for a favor, but of a man demanding his due. We've lost everything, Eleanor. I waited. I knew what was coming. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. We are your parents. We took care of you for 18 years. Now it's your turn. We need a place to live. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the final crushing weight of his pride giving way to the blunt, ugly demand. We need to move in with you." The words, when they finally came, landed with a dead, heavy thud in the center of my beautiful, peaceful living room. My mother nodded in tearful agreement, her eyes fixed on me, her expression one of absolute, unshakable certainty. In her mind, this was the natural order of things. The only possible solution. They had a problem. I was the solution. My life, my home, my hard-won peace, it was all just a resource to be deployed for their convenience. I looked from my mother's tearful, expectant face to my father's grim, demanding one. I thought of the 18-year-old girl they had put out on the street with a single suitcase and a dream they had called worthless. I thought of the 40 years of silence, of struggle, of building a life from the bedrock of their rejection. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not pity. Just a profound, cold, and quiet sense of clarity. The question had been asked. The bill had come due, and I knew with a certainty that was as deep and as solid as the foundation of the house around me what my answer was going to be. My father's demand, so blunt and so absolute, landed in the center of our elegant dining room and seemed to suck all the air out of the space. The soft ambient light from the chandelier seemed to dim. The scent of the lemon and rosemary chicken I had so carefully prepared turned to ash in my nostrils. I looked across the table at the two people who had given me life and then, just as casually, had shown me the door to it. Their faces were a mask of grim, righteous expectation. Had presented their problem. They had identified the solution. And the solution was me. David, my husband, my partner in the beautiful, quiet life we had built, started to speak. "Robert, Mary Ann," he began, his voice a low, reasonable buffer against their entitlement. "This is obviously a shock. I think we all need to take a moment to—" But I placed a hand on his arm, a silent signal. "Let me handle this." This was not his battle to fight. This was a ghost from my past, and I was the only one who could exorcise it. I didn't answer them right away. I just looked at my father's face. He was 78 years old, his face a roadmap of his own stubborn pride and poor decisions. But in that moment, in the harsh, unforgiving light of his demand, his expression was identical to the one he had worn 40 years ago. The same look of absolute, unshakable certainty in his own authority. The same dismissive contempt for my own life, my own dreams. And as I looked at him, the elegant dining room in Savannah dissolved. And I was plunged back into the stifling, wood-paneled living room of a small, cramped house in rural Georgia. On the longest and most important night of my life, I am 18 years old. The air in our house is thick with the smell of my mother's meatloaf and my father's disappointment. I am standing in the center of the living room, clutching two pieces of paper that represent my entire future. One is an acceptance letter to a small, prestigious liberal arts college in New England. The other is a letter informing me that I have been awarded a full 4-year scholarship for winning a national essay competition. In my other hand is a thin university literary journal, the pages still smelling of fresh ink, open to the page where my first ever published short story is printed. My heart is a frantic, terrified bird in my chest. I am about to tell my parents that I am not as they had planned. Going to be attending the local community college to get a sensible degree in business administration. I am going to be a writer. Well, my father says, not looking up from the television where a football game is blaring. "Spit it out, Eleanor. What is it?" "I got a scholarship, Daddy," I say, my voice a small, hopeful whisper, a full one. "To follow my dream." I hold out the literary journal, and I got published. My mother takes the journal from me. She looks at my name in print, a faint, puzzled smile on her face. "That's nice, dear," she says, her voice distracted. "That's a lovely little hobby. A hobby. The thing I have poured my entire adolescent soul into. The thing that has just won me a full scholarship is a lovely little hobby." My father finally looks up from the TV, his attention caught not by the scholarship, but by the name of the out-of-state college. His face hardens. "Where is that?" "Ah," he asks, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. "That's not the community college. That's 1,000 miles away. It's a better school, Robert," I say, my voice gaining a desperate strength. "It's one of the best literature programs in the country. This is a real chance for me." "A chance for what?" Standing up. He is a large, imposing man, and he uses his physicality to dominate every room he is in. "A chance to fill your head with more useless romantic nonsense? A chance to waste for years reading poetry and then end up waiting tables. Writing is not a job, Eleanor. It's a fantasy. It's a worthless hobby for people who are too lazy to do real work." His words are like stones, each one a heavy, bruising blow. "It's not worthless," I whisper, tears pricking my eyes. "It's what I'm good at. It's who I am." "No," he says, his voice now a full-throated roar of patriarchal authority. "Who you are as a daughter of this family. And your duty is to this family. Your duty is to get a sensible education, get a sensible job at the bank down the street, and help out around here. Not to run off to some fancy school 1,000 miles away to chase some childish dream." My mother, seeing my tears, steps in. But not to defend me. She comes to my side and places a placating hand on my arm. "Listen to your father, Eleanor," she says, her voice a soft, pleading whisper. "He just wants what's best for you. Don't make waves. Just be a good girl. Be a good girl." It is the mantra of my childhood, the iron bars of my cage. A good girl does not have her own dreams. A good girl has sensible ambitions that serve the needs of the family. "I can't," I say, my voice breaking. I look from my mother's pleading, tearful face to my father's thunderous one. "I can't stay here. I'll die here." My father's face sets like granite. He has issued his command, and I have defied it. This, in his world, is an unforgivable sin. "Fine," he says, his voice as cold as the grave. "Then you have made your choice. If you choose this fantasy over your family, over your responsibilities, then you can find somewhere else to live." The ultimatum hangs in the hot, silent air. My mother lets out a small, horrified gasp, but she does not contradict him. She just wrings her hands, a silent, weeping accomplice to my execution. I look at their faces, at the two people who are supposed to love me unconditionally, and I see only the rigid, unyielding walls of their expectations. And I know, with a certainty that is both terrifying and liberating, that there is no room for me, the real me, inside this house. "Okay," I whisper. I turn and walk back to my small bedroom. My hands are shaking, but my movements are deliberate. Pull my single worn suitcase from the top of my closet. I do not pack my dolls or my yearbooks. I pack my books, my notebooks. The journals filled with my stories. Pack the girl I am, and the woman I hope to become. My mother comes to the door, her face a mess of tears. "Don't do this, baby," she sobs. "Don't leave." He doesn't mean it. Yes, he does, I say, not looking at her, and so do I. I zip the suitcase and walk back out into the living room. My father is standing by the front door, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unforgiving mask. He does not look at me. He just pulls his worn leather wallet from his back pocket and takes out a single, folded $20 bill. He presses it into my hand. It is not a gift. It is a settlement. A final insulting severance package. Don't come crawling back here when you fail, he says, his voice a low, gravelly curse. I look at him, at this man who is my father, who is supposed to protect me, and I feel nothing but a profound, aching emptiness. I open the front door and step out into the cold, dark Georgia night. I do not look back. I walk down the long gravel driveway, my suitcase bumping against my leg, the sound loud in the cricket field. Silence. I walk until I reach the main road, and then I just stand there under the pale. Indifferent light of a single street lamp, 18 years old, with a suitcase full of books, $20 in my pocket, and a terrifying, unknown future stretching out before me. I am alone. I am an exile. And I am, for the first time in my life, completely and utterly free. The memory, as vivid and as painful as the night it happened, recedes, and I am back at my dining room table in Savannah. I am 58 years old. The house is beautiful. My husband's hand is a warm, steady presence on my own. And across the table, my father is staring at me, his face wearing the same proud, stubborn, and unforgiving expression he had worn 40 years ago. He has just demanded to be let back into the life he had so callously, so completely thrown me out of. I look at him, and the last lingering wisps of my childhood fear, of my daughterly obligation, are burned away by the clean, clarifying fire of the memory. I take a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I place the glass down on the table, the sound a soft, definitive click in the silent room. I'm sorry to hear that you have lost your home, I say, and my voice is calm, quiet, and completely steady. I truly am. It is a terrible thing. To lose one's home? My mother's eyes fill with a hopeful, grateful tear. She thinks I understand. She thinks I am about to grant her absolution. I look from her face to my father's. But 40 years ago, continue, my voice as soft and as sharp as surgical steel. On the night I needed you both the most, you made it very, very clear that your house was not my home. You made it clear that I was not welcome there if I chose to be myself. You taught me, on that night, to be completely and utterly self-reliant. You taught me that I could expect nothing from you, and that my survival was my own responsibility. I lean forward, my gaze holding them both captive. I am the woman I am today because of the hard and painful lesson you taught me all those years ago. And I will not dishonor that lesson now by pretending it never happened. I look at my father, at the man who had told me not to come crawling back. The answer is no, I say. You cannot move in with me. My quiet, unequivocal no landed in the center of the dining room with the force of a physical blow. The air, already thick with tension, seemed to solidify. The silence vibrating with the shock of a reality they had refused to contemplate. I watched the expressions on my parents' faces shift in a slow, agonizing sequence from the absolute certainty of a demand about to be met to a flicker of pure, uncomprehending confusion, and then, finally, to the dark, gathering storm of their shattered pride, my father. A man who had not been denied a single significant thing in his entire life by his family was the first to detonate. The weary, defeated old man I had seen on the porch just an hour ago was gone, replaced in an instant by the formidable, terrifying patriarch of my youth. He slammed his fist down on my polished mahogany dining table, the silverware jumping with a sharp, violent clatter. No. He roared, the word a blast of pure, incredulous fury. What do you mean, no? Did you hear me, Eleanor? We have lost everything. We have nowhere to go. This isn't a request. It is a statement of fact. And my refusal is also a statement of fact. Father, I replied, my voice a stark, quiet contrast to his bellow. How dare you? Ah! He spat, his face turning a deep, mottled red. After everything we did for you, we raised you. We fed you. We clothed you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. And this is the thanks we get. You, in your palace of a house, are going to turn your own mother and father out onto the street. What kind of a cold, heartless, ungrateful creature have you become? My mother, right on cue, began her offensive. Her weapons were not the hot shrapnel of my father's rage, but the quiet, suffocating poison of a mother's guilt. Tears welled. In her eyes, her face crumbling into a familiar mask of tragic, maternal martyrdom. Eleanor, how can you be so cruel? She wept, her voice a trembling instrument of manufactured pain. We are your parents. We are old. We are scared. And our own daughter, our own flesh and blood, is looking at us like we are strangers, like we are a burden. I don't understand what happened to this sweet little girl we raised. Family is supposed to be a refuge, a safe harbor. And you are turning us away in the middle of a storm. She looked around my beautiful dining room, her gaze sweeping over the art, the antique sideboard, the life I had built. Is this what all this success has done to you? Has it made your heart so small? I listened to their tandem attacks, the familiar one-two punch of my father's anger and my mother's guilt. It was the same strategy they had used. For my entire childhood to manage my emotions, to enforce my compliance. But I was not a child anymore. And my heart was not small. It was a fortress, and its walls had been built with the very stones they had thrown at me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water. My calmness in the face of their storm seemed to infuriate them even more. You're right, Father, I began, my voice even and measured. You did raise me. You raised me to believe that a home was a conditional space. That love was a transactional arrangement. You raised me to understand with a clarity a child should never have to possess. That if I did not conform to the precise shape of your expectations, I would be considered defective. You raised me to know that if I chose to be the person I was, born to be, I would be cut off without a moment's hesitation. I turned my gaze to my mother. And you're right too, Mom. I am not the sweet little girl you raised. That girl died on the night you stood by and watched your husband throw her out into the dark because she had the audacity to have a dream that was bigger than this family's imagination. That girl learned that your version of family was a harbor that was only safe for ships that were sailing in a direction you approved of. That is not what happened. My father roared, his denial a reflexive, protective instinct. We gave you a choice. You chose this. Yes, I said I did. And I have lived with the consequences of that choice every single day for 40 years. Now it is time for you to live with the consequences of yours. My voice was not the voice of a historian, detached and academic. It was the voice of a witness, giving testimony. The testimony of a life they had refused to see. You asked me what kind of person I have become. I said, the words now flowing, a torrent of truth that had been dammed up for a lifetime. I will tell you, I became the kind of person who, at 18 years old, learned to sleep on the floor of a friend's dorm room because she was too proud and too terrified to admit to anyone that she was homeless. I became the kind of person who learned to live on stale bread and instant coffee, who worked 3 jobs while carrying a full course load. Because the $20 you pressed into my hand was not a safety net. It was a final insulting dismissal. I looked at my mother. You ask me what people will think, Mom. I spent the first decade of my adult life consumed with what people would think. I was the girl with the sad, vague story about her family who lived far away. I was the girl who had no one to call on Christmas. Parents never once came to see her graduate. Not from her undergraduate, not from her master's, not from her PhD. I was the girl who got married in a courthouse with only her husband's family as witnesses, because her own parents refused to attend a wedding to a man they had never bothered to meet. We were busy, my father muttered. The excuse so pathetic, so transparently false, that it was almost laughable. Yes, you were, I agreed, my voice like ice. You were busy. You were busy for my wedding. You were busy when my first novel was published. You were busy when I bought this house. You have been busy for 40 years. Your silence has been the most consistent thing in my life. And I learned to live with it. I learned to build a life, a career, a marriage, a home in the vast, echoing space of your absence. I leaned forward, the force of my words the only thing moving in the still, tense room. Where were you when I had pneumonia in graduate school and had to be hospitalized, and I was so broke I had to sign up for a payment plan with the hospital? Where were you when my first book, the one that finally made me financially stable, was rejected 17 times and I almost gave up? Where were you, Dad, when I was trying to secure the mortgage for this house, and the bank saw a single woman with an unstable career as an author and almost denied me, and I had to fight for it tooth and nail all by myself? I looked at them both, at their stunned, pale faces. You were not there. You were never there. You chose not to be. And now, after 40 years of proving with every breath and every action that I am not a part of your life, you show up on my doorstep, in the home that I built from the ruins of the childhood you gave me, and you demand a room. You demand a key. You demand my sanctuary. The self-pity in my mother's eyes was beginning to be replaced by a glimmer of something else, a horrified, dawning comprehension. My father, however, was still clinging to the wreckage of his pride. It is a child's duty to care for their parents, he said, his voice a low, stubborn growl. It is a parent's duty to care for their child, a new voice said, calm and firm. It was David. He had been a silent, stoic witness to the entire exchange, his presence a quiet wall of support at my side. Now he spoke, and his words were not the words of an angry husband. They were the words of an impartial, unimpeachable observer. Robert, Marianne, he said, his voice full of a quiet, sorrowful authority. I have been married to your daughter for 30 years. I have been a witness to her life. I was there when she was so broke she had to choose between paying her rent and buying groceries. I was the one who held her when she wept on holidays, because she was mourning the family that was still alive but had chosen to be dead to her. I have seen the decades of quiet, lonely work she has poured into building this life. Everything she has said tonight is the absolute, unvarnished truth. He looked at my father, his gaze steady and unforgiving. You have no right to come into this house and speak of duty. You forfeited that right 40 years ago when you put your 18-year-old daughter out on the street. David's intervention was the final devastating blow. My father's righteous anger seemed to crumble, leaving behind the weak, sputtering defensiveness of a man who knows he is lost. He just stared at David, his mouth slightly agape, with nothing left to say. I stood up from the table, the movement a signal that this was over. "The conversation is over for tonight," I said, my voice now weary, the adrenaline of the confrontation. Fading, the guest bedroom is prepared. "You can stay here tonight. In the morning, we can discuss a more practical and separate living arrangement for you." I did not wait for a reply. I just looked at David, and together we walked out of the dining room, leaving my parents sitting there, alone and defeated, in the silent, glaring light of the beautiful life they had never wanted for me, and now, so desperately needed. The battle was over. Their authority was shattered, and the reckoning had just begun. The morning after the reckoning was unnervingly quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of emotional wreckage and a tense, exhausted silence. I came downstairs to find David had already made coffee. We sat together in the sun-drenched courtyard, the scent of jasmine, a sweet, almost mocking counterpoint to the bitterness of the previous night. We did not speak of what had happened. We simply sat to people in a fortress that had withstood a siege, quietly assessing the damage. My parents emerged an hour later. The change in their demeanor was profound. The righteous fury, the wounded pride, the condescending authority was all gone. They looked like two very old, very tired travelers who had finally reached the end of a long and difficult road, only to find that their destination was a foreign country where they did not speak the language. They were subdued, their movements hesitant, their eyes avoiding mine. They had been the undisputed rulers of their own small universe for nearly 80 years. Now, for the first time in their lives, they were powerless. And they did not know what to do next. My mother made a feeble attempt at normalcy. "It's a lovely morning, Eleanor," she said, her voice a small, fragile thing. "Yes, it is," I replied, my own voice gentle but distant. This was not a moment for gloating. The victory I had won was a somber one, and it brought me no joy, only a grim, weary sense of finality. The raging fire of the argument had burned away the last vestiges of our old relationship, leaving behind only the cold, hard ashes of the truth. There was no going back. The only question was what the new world, this strange post-war world, would look like. "I need today to make some arrangements," I said, breaking the awkward silence. "I will have a proposal for you to consider this evening." My father, a man who had made every major decision in their lives, just looked at me and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He was no longer in a position to make demands. He was waiting to receive terms. The transfer of power was complete. While my parents sat in the quiet, alien splendor of my living room, David and I retreated to my library. It was time for the final phase of my plan. The angry, hurt daughter had had her say last night. Now it was time for the pragmatic, clear-eyed author, the architect of her own life, to design a solution. "They cannot live here, David," I said, the words a quiet, firm declaration of the central, unshakable truth. It wouldn't be a home. It would be a permanent, round-the-clock historical reenactment of our own trauma. It would poison this house. It would poison us. "I know," he said, his hand resting on the back of my chair. "So what's the alternative?" "We can't just put them out on the street." No, I said. We can't. But whatever we do, it must be on our terms. It cannot be a familial embrace. It must be a financial transaction, clean, clear, with boundaries of steel. I spent the next 6 hours in a state of intense, focused work, the kind that had always been my refuge. I was no longer dealing with the messy, unpredictable world of emotions. I was dealing with a logistical problem, and logistical problems were my specialty. David worked alongside me, his architectural mind a perfect complement to my own. We're designing a new life for my parents, and we approached it with the same dispassionate precision we would bring to a new building project. First, the location. I researched assisted living and retirement communities in and around Savannah. I was not looking for the cheapest option. I was not being punitive. I was looking for a specific set of criteria: safety, cleanliness, good management, and a respectable distance from my own historic neighborhood. I found a place called Oakhaven Senior Living, a well-regarded community about 5 miles away. I took a virtual tour online. It had its own apartments, a communal dining hall, social activities. It was a perfectly pleasant, perfectly impersonal, and perfectly secure place for two people to live out their remaining years. It was not a home. It was housing. Next, the finances. I called our financial advisor and arranged for the creation of a new, separate account. From this account, I would set up 2 automatic payments. One would go directly to the management of Oakhaven to cover the 1-year prepaid lease on a 2-bedroom apartment. The other would be a monthly stipend deposited directly into my parents' bank account. I calculated the amount carefully. It was not lavish, but it was enough to cover their groceries, their healthcare copays, their gas, and a few small luxuries. It was a pension, a severance package for a lifetime of fail-led parenting. Finally, the legal framework. I called Marcus. I explained the situation and what I needed. An hour later, a simple 1-page document arrived via email. It was not a contract. It was a statement of familial support. It clearly outlined the terms: the prepaid 1-year lease, the exact amount of the monthly stipend, and a single clause at the bottom: this support is offered voluntarily and is subject to annual review and renewal at the sole discretion of the grantor. Eleanor Vance. It was not an open-ended promise. It was a 1-year deal. It was a probationary period. It was the ultimate final expression of my new power. I printed out the Oakhaven brochure, the financial summary, and the legal statement. I placed them all in a neat, professional folder. My proposal was ready. It was generous. It was practical. And it was as cold and impersonal as a corporate merger. It was charity, not family. That evening, we gathered again in the living room. The awkwardness had deepened into a thick, palpable dread. My parents looked like 2 defendants waiting for the jury to return with a verdict. I did not sit down. I stood before them, David, at my side, the folder in my hand. I have spent the day considering your situation, I began, my voice calm and formal, and I have come to a decision. You were correct when you said that you need a place to live and financial support, and I am in a position to provide that. A flicker of desperate, pitiful hope ignited in my mother's eyes. However, I continued, and that hope died as quickly as it had appeared. Let me be perfectly, unequivocally clear. My home is not an option. This house is a sanctuary that I have built for myself and for my husband. It is not and will never be a solution to the problems you have created for yourselves. Our lives will remain separate. I opened the folder. "What I am offering you is this," I said, and I proceeded to lay out the terms of my proposal, not as a daughter, but as a case manager. I presented the Oakhaven community, showing them the pictures of the clean, pleasant, but sterile apartment. I showed them the budget, the exact figure of the monthly stipend I would provide. I explained that I would handle the logistics of the move, that I would pay for the movers and the security deposit. And then I handed the statement of familial support to my father. "This document outlines the terms," I said. "Is a 1-year commitment from me. At the end of 1 year, we will reassess. This is my offer. It is the only offer I will be making." I watched them as they processed it. I saw the war on their faces. I saw the profound, gut-wrenching relief of being saved from the terrifying abyss of homelessness. And I saw the deep, stinging humiliation of the terms of that salvation. They were not being welcomed back into the fold. They were not being enfolded in the loving embrace of a forgiving daughter. They were being managed. They were being processed. They were being set up in a safe, clean, and respectable facility, like 2 elderly, difficult relatives that a dutiful but distant child was placing in a home. My father read the 1-page document, his hands trembling slightly. He read the final clause about the annual review, about my sole discretion. He understood. He was no longer the patriarch. He was a dependent. His pride, the massive, stubborn, and ruinous pride that had defined his entire life, was the final price he had to pay for his survival. He looked at my mother, whose face was a mess of tears, tears of relief, of sorrow, of shame. He looked around my beautiful home at the life that could have, in another world, been a part of his own. And then he looked at me, at the daughter he had exiled. He took a pen from his pocket, and with a shaky, defeated hand, he signed his name at the bottom of the page. My mother followed suit. The transaction was complete. The next few days were a blur of logistics. I moved my parents into their new apartment at Oakhaven. It was nice, clean, beige. It smelled of disinfectant and industrial carpet. It was a place devoid of history, of memory, of love. It was a solution, not a home. When the last box was moved in, we stood in the doorway of their new, impersonal life. The goodbyes were awkward, stilted. "Thank you, Eleanor," my mother whispered. Refusing to meet my eyes, my father just grunted, a sound of pure, resentful defeat. I did not hug them. I just nodded. "I'll be in touch about the stipend," I said, and then I turned and walked away, leaving them there in the quiet, beige hallway. That night, David and I sat on our porch, a bottle of expensive wine between us. The house was quiet again. The ghost had been put to rest, not in a shared home, but in a clean, well-managed facility 5 miles away. "Do you feel guilty?" David asked softly. I thought about it for a long time, swirling the deep red wine in my glass. "No," I said finally. "I don't. I feel sad. I feel a profound sadness for the family we could have been. But the woman they wanted me to be, the one who would sacrifice everything for them, she died a long time ago. They killed her." I took a sip of wine. It tasted of the earth, of history, of a complex and bittersweet vintage. It tasted like my life. My revenge was complete. It was not a fiery, satisfying victory. It was a quiet, sober, and meticulously executed act of boundary setting. I had fulfilled the last transactional duty I felt I owed them. I had protected my home. I had protected my peace. I had protected the life that I, the girl with the worthless hobby, had built for myself from the ruins they had left behind. And that was a victory that was entirely and finally my own. The first year of my parents' new life and of my new freedom passed in a quiet transactional rhythm. As stipulated in the statement of familial support I had drafted, I did my part. The first of every month, an automatic transfer of funds would leave my account and appear in theirs. Every quarter, I would have a brief, polite phone call with the manager of the Oak Haven Senior Living community to ensure there were no issues with their apartment or their conduct. I was, in essence, the remote, dispassionate administrator of their lives. In return, they did their part. They did not call. They did not show up on my doorstep. They did not attempt to reinsert themselves into the life from which they had been surgically excised. The only communication I received was a small, store-bought thank you card that would arrive in my Savannah mailbox around the 3rd of every month. Inside, in my mother's shaky handwriting, would be the same single stilted sentence: "Thank you for the support. We hope you are well. Sincerely, Mary Ann and Robert." It was not a letter. It was a receipt. A monthly acknowledgement of the transaction that now defined our relationship. There was no warmth in it, no news, no attempt at reconciliation. It was the communication of a dependent to their benefactor, and while it was profoundly sad, it was also, for me, a profound relief. The boundaries were holding. I continued my work. I finished the novel about the silk merchants of Lyon and began a new, ambitious project about the life of Artemisia Gentileschi, the 17th century Italian painter, who had used her art as a powerful form of revenge against the man who had assaulted her. I found her story resonated with me. A kinship across 4 centuries with a woman who had refused to be a victim, who had used her craft to reclaim her own narrative. My life with David settled back into its comfortable, scholarly rhythm. Fortress was secure. The ghosts, it seemed, had been put to rest. Then, one crisp morning in late October, a notification popped up on my digital calendar. It was an appointment I had set for myself a year ago, a cold, corporate reminder of a deeply personal duty. 10 a.m. Annual Review, Vance Support Agreement. A full year had passed. The lease on their apartment was up for renewal. The stipend was subject to my sole discretion. It was time to decide whether to continue the arrangement. It was time, I realized with a heavy heart, to see them again. I did not summon them to my home. That was my sanctuary, and it was a boundary I was not yet willing to breach. Instead, I invited them to lunch. I chose a quiet, historic restaurant in downtown Savannah, a neutral territory. I made the reservation for 4 people. David, my silent partner in all of this, would be by my side. I had not seen my parents in a year, and the change was palpable. They arrived at the restaurant looking not like the fiery, proud antagonists of my memory, but simply like 2 very old, very tired people. The year had settled them. The frantic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by a kind of quiet, institutionalized resignation. They had found a life of a sort at Oak Haven. My mother spoke of her weekly bridge club, my father of the small vegetable garden he had started in a community plot. They spoke of their lives in the same way one might describe the features of a well-run long-term care facility. It was safe, was clean, it was fine. The conversation over lunch was a masterpiece of polite, awkward evasion. We talked about the weather. We talked about the rising price of groceries. We talked about a news story we had all seen on the television. We talked about everything and anything except the one massive, unspoken thing that sat between us. The fact that our relationship was now a formal, annual review. I let the charade continue through the appetizer and the main course. But as the waiter cleared our plates and offered us dessert, I knew it was time. "I'm glad to see you both looking well," I began, my voice calm and even. I felt absurdly like a parole officer conducting a review. "As you know, the agreement we made last year was for a 1-year term. I wanted to meet today to discuss the renewal." My mother's hands, which had been resting on her lap, clenched together. My father, who had been staring out the window, turned his gaze to me. His expression was not angry, not resentful, but simply weary. "Is the apartment satisfactory?" I asked. "Is the monthly stipend sufficient for your needs?" "Yes, Eleanor," my mother said quickly, her voice a nervous flutter. "It's all very adequate. We are very grateful." Grateful. It was a word she had never used with me before. "Then I see no reason not to continue the arrangement," I said. "I will authorize my lawyer to renew the lease for another year, and the stipend will continue at its current level." A wave of profound, visible relief washed over both of their faces. Their future for another year was secure. The business of the meeting was concluded. But the human part, the part I had been dreading, was yet to come. My father, who had been almost completely silent throughout the meal, cleared his throat. "Your mother," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, not looking at me but at the salt shaker on the table. "She got one of your books from the library at Oak Haven." I was so surprised by the change of subject that I didn't know how to respond. "The one about the Queen," he continued, still avoiding my gaze. I knew which one he meant. "My most successful novel, a biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine." She read it. Then she made me read it. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the salt shaker in his thick, age-spotted fingers. "It was good," he said, the words sounding like they were being physically pulled from his throat. "It was a real book. You were right." He finally looked up at me, and in his faded, pale blue eyes, I saw not a challenge, not a demand, but a single, infinitesimal flicker of something I had never seen from him before. "Acknowledgement. That life you chose," he said, his voice a near whisper. "The writing, we were wrong about that. It's not a worthless hobby, and that was it." It was not a grand apology. It was not a tearful plea for forgiveness. It was something smaller, quieter, and in its own way, far more powerful. It was a concession. A 40-year-old argument, the one that had been the foundational text of my exile, had just been settled. He had, in his own proud, stubborn, and deeply limited way, admitted that I had been right. The validation, a thing I had told myself for decades I no longer needed, washed over me with the force of a quiet, gentle tide, smoothing over a wound I hadn't even realized was still there. The rest of the lunch was a strange, quiet denouement. The tension was gone, replaced by a somber, awkward peace. My mother, emboldened by my father's admission, showed me a picture on her phone of a new friend from her bridge club. My father asked me a single, genuine question about the book I was working on now. They were small, tentative gestures. The first, sit in steps across a chasm that was 40 years wide, when we parted ways on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. The goodbyes were not warm, but they were, for the first time, civil. My mother gave my arm a quick, hesitant squeeze. My father just looked at me and gave a single, stiff nod as David and I walked away. Under the canopy of ancient, moss-draped oaks in one of Savannah's beautiful sun-dappled squares, I felt the final heavy weight of my own story begin to lift. The revenge was over. The anger was gone. The hurt had been acknowledged. I had not gotten the warm, loving, supportive family I had so desperately craved as a child. The damage of the past was too deep, the architecture of our relationships too fundamentally broken to ever be fully repaired. But we had, at last, arrived at a kind of peace, a truce. A quiet, respectful, and deeply distant arrangement that allowed all of us to live out the remainder of our lives in our separate, secure fortresses. I reached for David's hand, his familiar warm grip, a comforting anchor in the present. I did not look back. Parents were a part of my history. Chapter in a book that I now finally knew how to end. The rest of my story, the blank pages stretching out before me, were mine and mine alone to write. And I knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that it was going to be beautiful.